Chapter 16. Trial. The Chatham County Courthouse was one of half a dozen modern buildings in downtown Savannah. It was made of precast concrete. Flat, blockish and bland, it sat against the western edge of the historic district. A companion building stood next to it and was linked to it by an underground tunnel. This other building, also made of concrete, was a vault-like cube with vertical slits for windows, the Chatham County Jail. The benches at the rear of Judge George Oliver's courtroom were filled to capacity on the first day of Jim Williams's trial. The windowless room had bright fluorescent lighting and sound-absorbing tiles that removed all tone and timbre from the human voice. Retired businessmen, housewives, and Williams' high society friends sat side by side with courthouse flax, newspaper and television reporters, and a fair number of local trial lawyers who had come to watch the famous Bobby Lee Cook take on the new district attorney. Jim Williams sat at the defense table, and his mother and sister sat a few feet behind him in the first row. Danny Hansford's mother, Emily Bannister, also attended the trial, but she was not permitted inside the courtroom. Bobby Lee Cook feared she might create a scene and prejudice the jury against Williams. He did not have her banned outright. Instead, he listed her as a defense witness, which had the same effect. Witnesses were not allowed to watch the proceedings until after they had testified. Cook, of course, had no intention of ever calling Mrs. Bannister to the stand, but his ploy would keep her out of the jury's sight. She came to the trial anyway and sat out in the corridor. "Don't look now," one of William's socialite friends murmured to a female chum as they arrived on the first day. "But there's Danny Hansford's $10 million mother." Emily Bannister, not yet 40, looked surprisingly youthful for a woman with a 21-year-old son. She had light brown hair and angular childlike features. Her expression, which one may have expected to reflect anger and resentment under the circumstances, was merely one of sadness. She spoke only to the woman who sat next to her, an assistant in the district attorney's office. When reporters approached, she turned away in silence. It was nearly lunchtime when the bailiff called out, "Order in the court. Extinguish all cigarettes. Please rise." Judge Oliver entered a room from behind the bench and took his seat in a high-back swivel chair. An imposing man, he had a mane of snowy white hair and a handsome, craggy face. He was a steward of the Wesley Monumental Church and had been in Mercer House many times, but never as a guest of Jim Williams. He had gone there in the 40s and 50s, when the house was the Shriners' Alley Temple. Oliver brought his gavel down and in a deep drawl called the courtroom to order. "All right, gentlemen, let's begin." In his opening statement, Lawton spoke earnestly and in a soft voice. He told the jury that in the coming days he would prove that James A. Williams had shot Danny Lewis Hansford in cold blood and with malice aforethought, and that afterward Williams had engaged in elaborate efforts not only to cover up what he had done, but to make it appear that he had done it in self-defense. Bobby Lee Cook then rose. He had long white hair, a square-cut goatee, and piercing eyes. He bore a striking resemblance to the image of Uncle Sam in James Montgomery Flagg's "I Want You" for the U.S. Army poster. Cook's habit of pointing his forefinger at the jury as he spoke only underscored the similarity. Cook said that the defense would disprove everything Spencer Lawton had just told them. They would learn, said Cook, that Danny Hansford was a violent and tempestuous character, and that he was the aggressor in this case. When the introductory remarks were over, Judge Oliver called a brief recess before beginning a parade of witnesses. In the corridor, a man in a short-sleeved shirt and slicked-down hair approached me. "I see you've been taking notes," he said. "You doing legwork for the defense?" "No," I said, "it's just for myself." The man was carrying a rolled-up newspaper. He had been sitting in the row in front of me, perched sideways in his seat with one arm slung over the back of the bench. Every so often he would laugh silently to himself, and his body would jerk in spasms of suppressed mirth. Then his head would roll back, and he'd peer through his grimy glasses at the proceedings. I took him to be a courthouse regular. "Spencer Lawton's on trial as much as Williams," he said. "They tell me he's been in hibernation for 2 months preparing his case. He turned his office into a bunker. Won't take telephone calls. Staff can't get in to see him. He and Deppish Kirkland, his chief assistant, they're trying to keep stuff away from the defense at all costs. They want to surprise him, turn it into a trial by ambush. They're paranoid about things leaking out. That's what I hear. It's strictly Bush League. The bottom line is Lawton's scared to death." "Who tells you all this?" I asked. "I hear things. People talk." The man looked from one end of the hall to the other. "I'll tell you one thing. Lawton's overplaying his hand in this case. See, it's not a murder case. Nobody thinks it is. The facts don't add up to it. It's manslaughter. Williams and Hansford argued. Someone grabbed a gun. Maybe Williams panicked afterwards and tried to rearrange things, but it wasn't premeditated." "Then why was Lawton going for a murder conviction?" "Could be politics," he said. "Could be he wants to win big after losing the Rangers case. Could be he doesn't want to appear too soft on hermaphrodites." "On what?" I asked. "Hermaphrodites," the man said. "That's what this whole thing's about, or haven't you heard?" "Oh, right," I said. That's what I've heard." Lawton opened his case by calling the police dispatcher who had been on duty the night of the shooting. The dispatcher said that at 2:58 a.m. she received a call from Jim Williams reporting that he'd been involved in a shooting at his residence. That was all she had to say. Next, Lawton called Joe Goodman to the stand. Goodman said that Williams had called him between 2:20 and 2:25 a.m. to say he had shot Danny. That left a gap of more than 30 minutes between the shooting and Williams' call to the police. The rest of Lawton's witnesses gave testimony bearing on what happened up to and during those 30 minutes. Their combined testimony brought out the prosecutor's theory of what had happened. Williams had fired once across his desk at an unarmed Danny Hansford. Hansford clutched his chest and fell to the floor face down. Williams then walked around the desk and fired at Hansford twice more at point-blank range, hitting him from behind the ear and in the back. Then he put the gun down on the desk, picked up a second gun, and fired at himself from Hansford's side of the desk to make it look as though Hansford had shot at him. One bullet passed through some papers. Another struck a metal belt buckle that had been lying on top of the desk. Williams wiped his fingerprints from this second gun, pulled Hansford's right hand out from under his body, and placed it over the gun. That's when he called Joe Goodman. While Goodman and his girlfriend were on their way, Williams went around his house, smashing bottles, overturning the big clock in the hall, and creating a scene of general mayhem. 30 minutes after calling Joe Goodman, Williams dialed the police. According to the prosecution, the physical evidence showed that Williams had made a series of blunders. When he fired the shots at himself, Williams had stood in the wrong place. He had stood where Danny's head lay. He should have stood where Danny's feet were. Second, police photographs of the top of the desk showed tiny paper fragments lying on top of the German Luger that Williams had said he'd used to shoot Hansford. This could only mean that Williams had already fired his gun at Hansford and laid it down before any bullets came from Hansford's side of the desk and hit the pile of papers, creating the paper fragments. Third, a bullet fragment was found on the seat of the chair that Williams had claimed he was sitting in when Danny shot at him. Fourth, the blood on Danny Hansford's hands was smeared, suggesting Williams had pulled Danny's hand out from under his body to place it on top of the gun. Strangest of all was the chair straddling Danny's legs. One of the chair legs was resting on the cuff of his blue jeans. It could only have been placed there after Danny died. The prosecution suggested that Williams had unintentionally put it there while rearranging the scene. Dr. Larry Howard, director of the State Crime Lab, summed up the prosecution's case. "The scene," he said, "appears contrived." Throughout the 4 days of prosecution testimony, Bobby Lee Cook rose repeatedly to challenge the state's witness in blistering cross-examinations. At one point, Cook seized on an apparent inconsistency in the state's theory that Hansford was lying face down on the floor when he was shot in the head. With a dramatic flourish, he lay down on the courtroom floor and asked Detective Joseph Jordan to position his head as Danny Hansford's had been. "Am I now lying on the floor, as the body of the deceased was lying when you saw it?" Cook asked, looking up at Detective Jordan. "Tilt your head over a bit to the right," said Detective Jordan. A little more. That's close. Yes, sir." "Are you aware," Cook asked, "that the point of entry at the head wound was the right side of the ear?" "Yes, sir," said the detective. "And is it not true that the right side of my head is lying securely upon the floor?" "That's correct." "Then the shot to the head could not have been fired as the victim lay on the floor," said Cook. "It would have been impossible, unless you got up under it to shoot." "That's basically correct," said the detective. "In fact, it would be completely illogical." Cook crowed. "It would be like telling someone that you could pour water uphill, wouldn't it?" "Yes, sir," said the detective. As for the absence of fingerprints on Danny's gun, Lawton himself elicited the comment from Detective Jordan that the textured surface of the Luger hand grip was a type that rarely yielded fingerprints. "It would not be conducive to a good fingerprint," said the detective. "It's too rough." The most damning feature of the state's case was the negative test for the gunshot residue on Danny's hands. Detective Joseph Jordan testified that he had taken great care to preserve whatever residue had been on Hansford's hands. He had placed paper bags on the hands, then fastened them with evidence tape. Randall Riddle, the technician who had performed the gunshot residue tests at the State Crime Lab, testified he had found no gunshot residue at all on Danny's hands. Cook bore into him. "You are familiar, of course, with antimony and lead and barium," said Cook. "You deal with these elements on a continuous basis in your specialty of gunshot residue analysis, do you not?" "Correct, sir," said Riddle. "What is the atomic weight of antimony?" Cook asked. "I don't recall," said Riddle. "What is the atomic weight of lead?" "I don't recall exactly," said Riddle. "What is the atomic weight of barium?" "I don't recall." "What is the atomic number of lead?" "I'm not familiar." "What is the atomic number of barium?" "I don't recall." "Of antimony?" "I don't recall," said Riddle, his face reddening. "What method of analysis did you utilize in examining the swabs from Mr. Hansford's hands?" Cook asked. "Atomic absorption," Riddle replied. "And you got negative results?" "Yes, sir." "Are you aware," Cook asked, "that in the Atlanta area, the atomic absorption tests yield negative results 60% of the time when it is done on the hands of persons known to have committed suicide with a gun?" "I would ask to see your figures, sir," Riddle answered. "You would like to see some figures on it," said Cook. "Do you know Dr. Joseph Burton?" "Yes, sir," said Riddle. "He's the medical examiner at Atlanta, I believe." Bobby Lee Cook called Joseph Burton as the first defense witness. As a medical examiner in Miami and Atlanta, Burton had performed some 7,000 autopsies. At the time of Jim Williams' trial, He was working on the well-publicized Atlanta child murder case of Wayne Williams. Dr. Burton had autopsied 9 of those murders. Cook was counting on him now to challenge the state's interpretation of much of the evidence in the case against Jim Williams. "Dr. Burton," Cook began, "what, in your opinion, is the significance of a negative result of gunshot residue on an atomic absorption test?" "A negative test has relatively little significance to me," said Burton. "A gun may give you a positive result on one firing and a negative result on another. It's an unreliable test. Virtually everyone in my profession of forensic pathology would like to see this test discontinued." Dr. Burton went on to say that he had conducted the study of gunshot residue tests on suicides and found that fewer than 50% tested positive. "Then, in your opinion," said Cook, "does a negative result indicate that the deceased did not fire a weapon?" "No, sir, it does not." Dr. Burton said he had visited Mercer House several times to reenact the shooting, and that it was his belief that all the shots had been fired from behind the desk. "It would be physically impossible to walk around and shoot either the head shot or the back shot and then have them go through the body and end up in the floor the way they did." Burton interpreted the evidence just as the coroner, Dr. Metz, had suggested. The first bullet struck Hansford in the chest and spun him counterclockwise, accounting for the second and third bullets entering from the rear. Burton called attention to small particles of skull and hair that had been found in the southwest corner of the room, several feet from Danny's head. "They were not from the bullet, passing through the body," he said, "and they followed the same line the bullet followed." "So Williams did not deliver a coup de grace," said Burton. "He fired 2 to 3 shots in rapid succession. Bam, 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 fast as the body fell to the floor. It accounts for the pieces of bone, the hair, the holes in the floor, the blood spatters, and the angles of the body." Dr. Burton offered an explanation for the presence of smeared blood on Hansford's hand. After the first shot had hit him, Hansford might have dropped his gun and clutched his chest. Then, as the body hit the floor, the hand may simply have sprung out to the side. Then the blood would have been smeared on the hand as the hand came out from under the body. "The chair on the pants leg?" "The chair doesn't really concern me in this case," said Dr. Burton. "It doesn't indicate a contrived scene. In fact, it would go against someone trying to set this scene up because it would seems to be somewhat out of place sitting on his leg." By the time Dr. Burton was finished testifying, the defense had responded to most of the prosecution's arguments. In addition, over Lawton's objections, the defense had called several witnesses who testified that Danny Hansford was an extremely violent young man. A psychiatrist at Georgia Regional Hospital told of treating Hansford after he had broken furniture in his mother's house and threatened to kill someone. The doctor said that Hansford had to be subdued and secluded because he was dangerous to the hospital staff and to himself. A nurse at the hospital had told on occasion that when she had admitted Hansford, she classified him as homicidal on the admission form. A week after his death, in fact, Hansford had been due to appear in court on a charge related to a fistfight with a neighbour. Williams had paid the $600 bond to get him out of jail that time too. The prevailing opinion in the corridors of the courthouse was that Bobby Lee Cook had raised just enough doubt about the state's case to enable jurors to vote not guilty in good conscience. The groundwork had been laid for an acquittal. Now it was up to Jim Williams to take the stand and win the sympathy of the jury. It was a jury composed of 6 men and 6 women. They were plain, middle-class people: a secretary, a teacher, housewives, a nurse, a plumber. One of the women was black, the rest of the jury was white. Williams took the stand, dressed in a pale grey suit. He leaned forward respectfully as Bobby Lee Cook guided him gently through a narrative of his modest childhood in Gordon, Georgia. Williams told about his arrival in Savannah at the age of 21, his restoration of houses, his success in business, and his rise in Savannah society. He spoke with a confident, somewhat lofty tone. He explained that twice a year he attended the International Fabergé sales in Geneva. "You heard of Fabergé perfume?" said Williams. "We are not talking about that. Carl Fabergé was the court jeweler to the Tsar of Russia and to most other European courts. He made some of the finest works of art anybody has ever created. I collect Fabergé in a small way." Williams recalled how he had met Danny Hansford. "I was getting up out of my car in front of the house, and this fellow rolled up on a bicycle. He said somebody had told him that I hired people to work in my workshop who had no experience. I said, well, that is true, but I only hire people who are capable of learning things. Danny started off by stripping the finishes off the furniture. He worked on and off for 2 years, part-time. He would leave town and then come back." In precise and chilling detail, Williams described Danny's rampage through the house on April 3rd, a month before he died. Danny stood in the bedroom, having fired a shot into the floor, glaring at Williams, gun in hand. "How damn mad do I have to be to make you kill me?" he said. Then he went outside and fired into the square. When Williams called the police, Danny ran upstairs and pretended to be asleep in bed. It was shortly after that incident that Williams asked Hansford to go with him on his buying trip to Europe. Williams explained that his health had begun to suffer and that he had blacked out several times from hypoglycemia. He needed someone to accompany him. "I didn't want to pass out somewhere en route without somebody with me for 2 reasons, health-wise and money-wise." Williams would be carrying a large quantity of cash, he said, "because you get a far better rate of exchange on your money if you take it in cash." He had asked Danny to go along because I thought I could control him. But in mid-April, Hansford told Williams he was planning to take marijuana on the trip, and Williams said in that case he could not go. "Danny and I agreed we'd ask Joe Goodman to go instead," said Williams. "We were both happy with that arrangement. Danny could smoke his dope in Savannah, and I'd have somebody to go on my trip with me." A week later, on the night of the shooting, Danny had exploded in fury. As Williams told it, Danny had carried on about how his mother put him in detention centers and how she had hated him because he looked like his father, whom she had divorced. He raged on about his friend George Hill wanting his car, and about his girlfriend Bonnie, who wouldn't marry him because he didn't have a steady job. He then turned on Williams. "And you took away my trip to Europe." Hansford stomped the Atari game. Williams stood up and walked out of the room. Hansford grabbed him by the throat and threw him up against the door. Williams pulled away and went to his study to call the police. Danny came into the study after him. "Who are you calling?" he demanded. "I had to think real quick," said Williams. "I said I'm calling Joe Goodman to tell him the European trip is off." Williams dialed Joe Goodman. Both he and Danny spoke to Goodman on the phone. That was at 2:05 a.m. The call had lasted a few minutes. Williams continued his story as the packed courtroom listened in silence. "Danny sat down in the chair opposite me and leaned back. He picked up a silver tankard and held it in his hand and just looked at it. And then he said, 'You know, this silver tankard has just about made up its mind to go through that painting over there.' It was an English painting, about 8.5 feet by 10 feet, of the Drake family in the 18th century. Danny had that crazed look on his face. I stood up and I put my finger straight out and I said, Danny Hansford, you are not going to tear up my house anymore. Now you get out. That's when Danny got up and went out into the hall, and there were crashing sounds. He came back with a gun in his hand and he said, I'm leaving tomorrow, but you're leaving tonight. The minute I saw that Luger, said Williams, I reached into my drawer. As I was coming up from my seat, a bullet was fired at me. I felt the breeze go right by my arm. Sometime between 2:20 and 2:25 a.m., Williams called Joe Goodman again, this time to tell him he had shot Danny. Spencer Lawton stepped up for the cross-examination. He began by asking Williams to describe the guns he kept in Mercer House. The gun in the downstairs hall, the gun in the rear parlour, the gun in the study, the gun in the living room. Williams sat back in his chair with his chin slightly raised. He stared at Lawton with a look of icy disdain and answered his questions in clipped syllables. Lawton led Williams once more through the events of the night of the shooting, to the point where Williams said he felt the breeze of the first bullet go by his right arm. Do you recall, Lawton asked, having told Albert Scardino of the Georgia Gazette in the interview 4 days after the incident that you felt a bullet go past your left arm? Mr. Lawton, said Williams, under those conditions, I was not taking notes. Could it be, said Lawton, that you have some doubt as to which side of you the bullet went on because you were standing on the other side of the desk when you fired the bullet into the paper? I never fired any bullet into any paper on any desk. What are you talking about? And that therefore, thinking about yourself from this position, you get your arms mixed up? Williams looked down from the stand with an expression of loathing. He was obdurate and imperious, not even slightly defensive. For all the world, he could have been a czar in his Fabergé cufflinks, the Emperor Maximilian, sitting at his golden-encrusted desk. Williams assumed the haughty boredom of all the monarchs and aristocrats whose portraits and baubles he now owned. Lawton moved on to another topic. You've testified at considerable length concerning your relationship with Danny Hansford. Other than the fact that, as you tell it, he attacked you, did you have any reason to want to see him dead? None whatsoever. You had no particular resentment or dislike for him, no anger at him. If I had, he wouldn't have been around me. I was trying to straighten him out. I was trying to help him, and he made progress. I have to say, said Lawton, that from what you said of it, you do seem exquisitely solicitous of his needs. You had some unusual feelings about him, didn't you? Because what unusual feelings? Williams cut in. I get the impression you considered it somewhat your personal charge to save him from himself. It's just that I was trying to help him make something of his life. Danny said to me on more than one occasion, you're the only person who's ever really tried to help me. You're the only person who hasn't used me. Well now, said Lawton, again I don't want to seem picky, but I do want to understand the nature of the relationship and... Fine, said Williams. What exactly did he do for you? He drove? Yes. I think you testified that he was employed by you in 2 other capacities, one as a part-time worker in your shop and the other to look after you because of your health conditions. Is that correct? Yes. He would come by and check on me. Sometimes he would spend the night in the house. Sometimes he and his girlfriend would both spend the night in the house. Did you ever pay him for any other work or service that he did other than what we just described? He used to move furniture for me in my pickup truck, but in no other capacity. And no other work or anything did you pay him? How do you mean? Williams asked coldly. What other work would there be? I'm just asking you. I just want to be sure that I've got it right. At this point, it was Spencer Lawton who was playing his witness like a bass. The stubbornly evasive Williams became... Oh, fuck. The more stubbornly evasive Williams became, the more Lawton seemed to encourage him. His intention was not to hook Williams at all, but to tease him along and draw out the play. One more time he asked Williams if he had anything to add about himself and Danny. Does the situation we've just been outlining fully describe your relationship with Danny? Uh-huh. Indicating yes, yes. Williams appeared to be holding back a smile. He felt that he was winning this test of wills. He had not broken under Lawton's insistent probing. He had made it through to the end of his testimony with his good name still intact. From here on, it would be all in his favor. He was to be followed on the stand by 7 unimpeachable character witnesses, 7 of Savannah's most upstanding citizens. They were waiting in the corridor, out of hearing of the proceedings. There was Alice Dowling, the widow of the late ambassador. There was Alice Dowling, the widow of the late Ambassador Dowling, the silver-haired George Patterson, a retired bank president, Hal Horner, another retired banker, Carol Fulton, the pretty blonde wife of Dr. Todd Fulton, Lucille Wright, the cateress. They and others were waiting to tell the jury about Jim Williams' peaceable nature and his good character. Williams stepped down from the stand to await the endorsement of his friends and the conclusion of the trial. But those endorsements would have to wait. Spencer Lawton announced he had 2 witnesses to call in rebuttal to Williams' testimony. If it please the court, he said, I'll call the state's next witness, George Hill. George Hill was 22 years old. He had curly dark hair and a hefty build. He took the stand and identified himself as a deckhand on the tugboat in Thunderbolt. He had been Danny Hansford's best friend. He also knew Jim Williams. Lawton asked him if he could testify. If I could identify, dickhead. Lawton asked him if he could identify Williams anywhere in the courtroom. Hill pointed to him at the defense table. Do you know whether or not Danny Hansford had any sort of relationship at all with Jim Williams? Lawton asked. Yes, I do, said Hill. What, if anything, do you know about that relationship? Well, Mr. Williams was giving Danny money when he needed it. He bought him a nice car and gave him fine clothes in exchange for going to bed with him. In exchange for who, what, what? I'm sorry? For Danny to sleep with him. How do you know that? Me and Danny talked about it a few times. Danny told me he liked the money and everything. He said it was fine with him if Mr. Williams wanted to pay him to suck his dick. George Hill's words were framed in silence. Lawton paused so as not to crowd them or diminish their effect. Members of the jury stole glances at one another. Blanche Williams looked down at her lap. The courtroom flack sitting in front of me laughed his silent laugh. Bobby Lee Cook sat in stony silence. Earlier in the day, in a session of the judge's chambers, he had lodged formal objections to Lawton's stated intention of bringing George Hill to the stand to say what he had just said. Cook had told the judge that any testimony based on statements made to Hill by Danny Hansford would constitute inadmissible hearsay. He urged Judge Oliver to be wary. If George Hill were allowed to cross the line, it would be impossible to tell the jury to ignore what it had heard. You can't unring the bell, he said. You can't throw a skunk in the jury box and then tell them they didn't smell it. But Lawton argued that George Hill's testimony would introduce a motive for the killing, and Judge Oliver ruled that he could testify. Did Danny ever tell you of any disagreements he had with Mr. Williams? Lawton continued. Well, a few times when I was over there, said Hill, they had a few small ones. Whenever Mr. Williams wouldn't give Danny the money he wanted. One time, I wasn't there when the argument took place. Danny started dating a girl named Bonnie Waters, and Mr. Williams wasn't too happy about it. He bought Danny a $400 gold necklace with the agreement that Danny would quit seeing the girl. Danny gave the necklace to Bonnie and then took her over to the house with it on. Williams got pretty mad and told him he'd have to pack his stuff and leave. Danny was real worried that he'd just lost his meal ticket. When was this? About 2 nights before he died. For his cross-examination, Bobby Lee Cook took a time fuck's sake. For his cross-examination, Bobby Lee Cook took a kindly uncle tone. He asked Hill to tell the story of his fondness for guns. Hill had 2 pistols and 4 rifles, and about the time he had assaulted another boy and the boy's father and knocked their door down. Cook asked Hill to tell how he and a friend had once been arrested for shooting out 15 streetlights. Cook also wanted to know why George Hill had not told the authorities about the necklace and Danny Hansford and Jim Williams for more than 6 months, until just before the trial. When you finally told someone, Cook asked, who did you talk to? Well, said Hill, Danny's mother got in touch with me and asked me to please talk to her attorney or one of the district attorneys. Oh, Danny's mother got in touch with you? Cook assumed a look of surprise. Yes, sir. She got in touch with you because she told you she had a lawsuit against Jim Williams, didn't she? And she wanted to collect $10 million and would give you part of it, didn't she? That's a lie, said Hill. I don't think it's very polite of you to say things like that. It was Bobby Lee Cook's turn to pause and let the silence in the courtroom emphasize the point he had just made. Spencer Lawton's second rebuttal witness was another young friend of Danny Hansford's, Greg Kerr. Kerr was 21 and blonde and worked in the press room of the Savannah Evening Press. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and was visibly nervous. Knowing that he would probably be confronted with it anyway, he blurted out every bad thing about himself that he could think of. He had been arrested for possession of drugs and obstruction of justice. He had been involved in the homosexual scene ever since he was seduced by a high school teacher. But his last homosexual encounter had been 3 weeks ago, he said, and he was out of it for good now. Do you, of your own knowledge, Lawton asked, know of any relationship that Danny Hansford may have had with Jim Williams? Yes, I do, said Kerr. How do you know? Asked Lawton. I went to their house to play backgammon, and Danny stepped out of the room or something to go to the restroom. I said, he's a very nice-looking young man, and Mr. Williams said, yes, he's good in bed, too. Also, he's well endowed. Did Danny use drugs? Lawton asked. Yes, he did, said Kerr. He had marijuana at the house when I was over there one time. Did he ever say anything to you about where he got it? Yes, he did. He said Jim buys all my drugs. Bobby Lee Cook leapt to his feet. Your Honor, this is the rankest and purest form of hearsay. Judge Oliver overruled the objection. On cross-examination, John Wright Jones brought out the fact that once, in the middle of a backgammon game, Jim Williams had accused Greg Kerr of cheating and had hit him over the head with the backgammon board. So Kerr's testimony might have been motivated by spite, but Kerr insisted it was not. He said that upon reading a copy of the Evening Press earlier in the week, during the trial, he had learned that Danny Hansford had been described in court as having a violent temper. Having read that, Greg Kerr decided it was his duty to come forward. Mr. Williams had assured me numerous times that he was innocent, said Kerr, and he bragged to everyone that he would know that he would just appeal again and again. So I felt that, Mr. Hansford is dead, and after I read about how everybody was cutting him down, I decided to come up here. I called Mr. Lawton, I would say around 10:30 at night. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Jones asked. I thought about doing it many times, but I was scared because I was still involved with the homosexual scene, and I just felt I shouldn't. And when did you say you extracted yourself from the homosexual scene, as you put it? Well, I've been trying for 3 or 4 years. I did have one homosexual experience. The last one was 3 weeks ago, which I barely remember, but up until that point it had been a month and a half. I am doing good, and I will never go back to that topic of life again because it's wrong. It's in the Bible that it's wrong, and I urge all homosexuals to please get out of it while they can, because then they're going to end up an old fuddy-duddy, and nobody's going to want them. I'm lucky. I'm just a young man, and I'm out of it. You're out of it about 3 weeks at this stage. I'm out of it. No further questions, said Jones. Greg Kerr stepped down and left the courtroom. Bobby Lee Cook stood up at the defense table. Call in Mrs. Dowling, please. Alice Dowling, the late ambassador's widow, walked into the courtroom with a pleasant smile and not the slightest idea of what had been going on while she and the others had been waiting in the corridor. She said she had known Jim Williams ever since he had been a consultant on the restoration of her house on Oglethorpe Avenue. Have you had occasion to visit with Mr. Williams at his home and parties and festivities and social occasions? Cook asked. Yes, said Mrs. Dowling politely. For many years we have attended his Christmas parties. On any of those or other occasions, have you noticed anything that would indicate the use or approval of drugs by Mr. Williams? Never, said Mrs. Dowling. Spencer Lawton then cross-examined Mrs. Dowling. Mrs. Dowling, have you ever heard anything of a relationship that Jim Williams may have had with a young man named Danny Hansford? No, sir, Mrs. Dowling said. I know absolutely nothing about Mr. Williams' private life. Thank you, said Lawton. That's all I have. One by one, the highly respected friends of Jim Williams entered the courtroom and took the stand to vouch for his good character. One by one, they all said that he had been at his lovely Christmas parties, had never saw drugs or anything being used or approved of by him, and knew nothing of Danny Hansford. The parade of witnesses over, the judge called a recess for the weekend, admonishing the jurors not to talk about the case to anyone and not to look at newspaper and television coverage of it. On Monday, the trial would resume for closing arguments and the judge's instructions to the jury. On Sunday, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, the Savannah Morning News published a story about the grim living conditions in the Chatham County Jail. A federal judge had toured the facility and pronounced it filthy. He was amazed and appalled, he said, by the lack of sanitation. Inmates were crowded, ill-fed, dirty, and lacked medical attention. The building was only 3 years old, a modern concrete structure with a fringe of neatly landscaped lawn. At night, it was spotlit and looked as clean and tranquil as a branch bank in Palm Springs. But the inside was a different story. Chaos reigned, to hear the judge tell it. There is no supervision, he said. Food is terribly handled. On Monday morning, the mood in the courtroom was tense. The revelations about the jail seemed to raise the stakes in the trial. Spencer Lawton rose to make his closing argument. "There's a lot more wrong with Jim Williams than hypoglycemia," he said. "Jim Williams is a man 50 years of age. He is a man of immense wealth, of obvious sophistication. He lives in an elegant home, travels abroad twice a year. He has many powerful and attractive and influential friends. There is something else about Williams, too. He has a house full of German Lugers, cocked and loaded all the time. He has a Nazi hood ornament on a desk in his study. He has a Nazi officer's ring with the skull and crossbones on it. Danny Hansford was an immature, uneducated, unsophisticated, confused, temperamental young man, preoccupied with feelings of betrayal and rejection, even at the hands of his mother, says Jim Williams. I suggest to you that Danny Hansford was a young man who was a great deal more tragic than evil. Can you not imagine how easily impressed a young man like that would be, living in a house, being friends with a man of Jim Williams' stature? Danny Hansford was never someone that Jim Williams really cared for. He was a pawn, nothing more, nothing less than a pawn in a sick little game of manipulation and exploitation. Danny maybe thought of himself as a bit of a hustler. Well, he was in way over his head. He was playing for keeps with a pro, and he turned out to be the ultimate loser. I don't think he was a hustler. I think he was being hustled. I think he was what amounts to a prisoner in a comfortable concentration camp, where the torture was not physical, but emotional and psychological. There is abundant reason to wonder why in the world Jim Williams would keep somebody around that he knew to be an unskilled, undependable, highly emotional, depressed psychotic, to protect and serve him in his hour of greatest need, when he collapsed in fainting spells and became comatose. And there is every reason to wonder why Jim Williams would voluntarily take to Europe somebody who he says was felonious, violent, and psychopathic. Lawton was eloquent and venomous. He spoke softly, as he had through the 6-day trial, but his righteous anger rang out through the courtroom like a shout. "What happened was an act of murder," said Lawton. "The self-defense was a cover-up. It did not occur. Thomas Hobbes is often quoted as having said that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and surely it must have seemed so to Danny Hansford during the last 15 or 20 seconds of his life, while his life was oozing out onto Jim Williams' Persian rug. It was during his closing argument, in the final moments of the trial, that Lawton introduced a new and diabolical element into the state's theory of what had really happened. Lawton suggested that the earlier episodes of violence at Mercer House, Danny's rampage on the evening of April 3rd when he had stormed through the house and fired a gun into the bedroom floor, was all a hoax. Williams had staged it, Lawton suggested, as a prelude for murdering Hansford a month later. Could it be a setup? He asked. Could Jim Williams have known that about now he would be testifying in court that he had been forced to kill Danny Hansford in self-defense? Did Williams want to create some evidence of Danny's violent nature, get something into the police records, set it up while Danny was asleep upstairs? Lawton was proposing that the shooting of Danny Hansford was neither self-defense nor a crime of passion, but a carefully planned murder. He was suggesting that on April 3rd, while Danny Hansford lay sleeping upstairs, Williams was downstairs stomping a marble top table, slamming a glass-cut pitcher into the floor, smashing 18th century porcelain objects, and firing a German Luger into Monterey Square, all with the intention of calling the police afterwards and blaming it on Hansford. Why didn't the shot into the bedroom floor wake Danny up? Because, according to Lawton's theory, nobody fired a bullet into the bedroom floor that night. The bullet hole in the bedroom floor was an old bullet hole. Lawton had persuasive evidence of that. Corporal Michael Anderson, the police officer who had come to the house that night, had testified about that earlier incident. We pulled up the carpet and we did see a bullet hole in the floor, but we couldn't find no bullet. I couldn't determine that it was a fresh bullet hole or an old one. Now, in his closing comments, Lawton told the jury, obviously Corporal Ensign did not believe that the bullet hole was created by Danny Hansford. Bobby Lee Cook, with his only closing statement left to him, could not call witnesses or re-cross-examine Corporal Anderson in rebuttal to Lawton's startling allegation. When Lawton was finished, the judge called a recess for the day. In the morning, the benches were once again filled to overflowing. Judge Oliver read a long list of instructions and then excused the jury to consider its verdict. 3 hours later, word spread through the courthouse that the jury was returning to the courtroom. The bailiff called the court to order, and the jury filed in. Mr. Foreman, have you arrived at a verdict? Asked Judge Oliver. Mr. Foreman, have you arrived at a verdict? Asked Judge Oliver. Yes, sir, we have, said the foreman. Would you give it to the clerk that he may publish it? The foreman handed a piece of paper to the clerk, who stood up and read from the paper. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of murder. A gasp of surprise sounded throughout the courtroom. The sentence is life imprisonment, said Oliver. 2 bailiffs approached Williams and escorted him to a small door at the end of the jury box. Before going through the door, Williams paused briefly and looked back, his expression blank, his dark eyes as impenetrable as ever. The spectators flowed out of the courtroom into the corridor and formed a crowd around Bobby Lee Cook, who stood in the glare of television lights, expressing his disappointment and saying he would file a notice of appeal within a few days. While he spoke, a solitary figure walked around the fringe of the crowd and stepped into an elevator, unnoticed by the reporters. It was Emily Bannister, Danny Hansford's mother. She turned as the elevator door started to close. It was not really a smile that crossed her face, so much as a look of quiet satisfaction.